What is up guys, this is Wim, and in this video I will show you how to create and arrange a dark melodic techno track in the style of old Afterlife productions. So first of all, I have to give a special shout out to Lil Mind, who purchased the God mode on my Patreon site. Thank you so much for your huge donation and support, I highly appreciate it. Let's get first into the track analysis. So in most modern melodic techno productions, you mostly see it that the arrangement is very similar in every single track. With those older and darker Afterlife productions, we actually have it quite different. Most of the time we have no particular structure in the track, and it's sometimes even hard to tell when a new bar or a new part of the track is starting, because we have a way more fluid arrangement in the track. And the reason of that is that the synths and the automations of the synths are really driving the arrangement of the track. Most of the time we also see rather simple projects with not too many elements involved. That especially applies for the drums. We usually have a lack of high frequencies in the drums and there are not too many elements playing. Because of that, it is very important that we have one major synth sound which can play pretty much through the whole track and it doesn't get boring. Now this is usually also a rather simple melody which is easy to remember and can take you really into a trance-like state. On top of that, we want to create this very nice and dark big atmospheres, and we can use some ambient sounds like noises or also some synth sounds with a lot of reverb on top. Now those are already the most important things that you need to create a track in the style of those darker melodic techno productions. So for those kind of tracks, the choice of the kick is already very important. We want to find a nice and dark subby sounding kick. I found this kick here and I just did some minor adjustment. So you can see this kick has a really nice room atmosphere and it harmonizes perfectly with our bass that we created here. And it's really useful to take your time and really play around with every single parameter here, because as I already said in previous videos, every single track needs a different sound, and for that it's very useful, to just play around with your presets, and then you can come up with something like this. You see some basic EQing that I'll do always. I'm cutting out the very subby frequencies here because I don't want to have them in the mix. Then we have a simple Ableton delay here in the ping pong mode. If you want to use the ping pong mode on the bass, it's very important that you cut out those sub frequencies here, because it can really get uncomfortable for your ears, and that way it's just way better. And also I took a little bit of the width out here again. Now as always, I also add a little bit of group processing on the kick and bass. Again, I have the Arturia compressor here, turned down this dry and wet slightly. And then we have one of my favorite new plugins here. I already mentioned it in my previous videos. It's from Analog Obsession and it has this really nice distortion and also this nice sub frequencies in the mix. Just really glues the sounds together. Let's have a look at the drums. And the drums are also quite interesting here, and that's what we typically see in this darker melodic techno productions. You can really play around with it here and get creative. For example, with this clap, it's not the usual clap pattern you would see here. We have it quite offbeat at some points, and I just really played around with it, also with the velocities over here, as you can see. Now you can see we're even leaving some hits here completely away. And yeah, if you want to make your production stand out, you really have to get creative and just try some new techniques and not just go with a basic clap pattern here. For this, I just used one of my samples here and I just did some basic EQing and just throwing on a little bit of reverb, and that just really helps to pushing this clap further in the background. Now we have a quite interesting shaker hi-hat sound here, where we added quite a lot of processing. So a lot of effects. Let's have a look what is going on here. I'm gonna turn them off one by one. First of all, we actually cut it out all the low frequencies over here. Then we added this grain delay. I really like to use that sometimes for the drum, because you have some really nice options in here, like this random pitch, for example. After that, we added this preset again for me, which I use very often. It's just a white noise layer on top. Then we have this preset, which I also use a lot from the auto pan, just panning the sound slightly to the left and right. And then we have the effect rack here from Sound Toys. I use the decapitator as always. And this time we're seeing a very interesting technique. We're using the Echo Boy here, which is a delay effect, but we're turning the echo time down to 0 milliseconds. So basically the left and the right side playing at the same time. And also the feedback is at 0 here, so we basically don't have a delay effect. But what we are using here, we're using the styles of the Echo Boy. We also added some saturation, but that's just a very interesting sound design technique, especially for drums, where you can just get a really unique texture to your sound. After that, we're just cutting away a lot of frequencies again. And then we're actually using the Haas effect, which I already explained in my previous video. It's actually the same thing that we're doing with the delay here, which is just spreading your sound a little bit into stereo. Now after that, we have a classic hi-hat sound, which is generated from a synthesizer here from the Mini 3. And I really like to use this plugin for my hi-hat sounds. It really has a nice texture. And the reason why it's much better sometimes to use a synthesizer instead of a hi-hat sound is of course because we have this option here to also automate the decay and maybe also some other parameters later. So for the last sound, we actually have a very classic shaker sound where I just took a little bit away of that high end again. And as you can see, in general, we're having quite dark sounds in here. We don't have any super sharp hi-hat sounds or claps. This is really the only one that is having a little bit more high end. But in general, we want to keep these dark vibes, especially in the drums. And also we want to mix them quite low so they're not too prominent in the track. And that way you just get this really nice dark atmosphere. And we are also leaving some room for the synth sounds later on. And of course, we also added a little bit of group processing here. As always, I'm compressing the sound here slightly with one of my presets. And then this time I actually used this rare effect from Analog Obsession. I think you can boost the very high frequencies here. I used this because I had the feeling that the drums were actually a little bit too dark. And so you can just add this really nice equalizer curve. Of course, you can also use the equalizer from Ableton for this. But sometimes those effects just sound a little bit more smooth. So now we actually get to the more important part, which is the synth sounds. As I said in the intro, it is very important that we find a nice melody and also a very nice synth sound that really doesn't get boring throughout the whole track. So I created this sound here. And it sounds very complex, but it's actually not too crazy. Let's have a look at the melody first, which is just sounding really nice. And I also already said that in the intro. The simpler the melody, the easier it just gets to remember it. I just jammed around with my keyboard a little bit, and as you can see, we have some interesting velocity movements here. And as you can see, the notes are just also sometimes slightly offbeat and not quantized perfect. Let's turn off the effects for now and have a look at the synth sound. And as you can see, the sound sounds quite complex, but we're actually just having one oscillator here. Those two are turned off and we're just adding some noise and also some feedback here. So even those nice, interesting sounds can be quite simple sometimes. Of course, later on, if we go into the automation, we could still add some other oscillators to make it even more interesting, but that's good for the start, just a simple saw wave. First of all, I'm actually taking a little bit of that width out again, and then as always, it's a good idea to cut away the unnecessary frequencies here, and also we don't want to have any too sharp frequencies on this lead sound, because again, we want to create this nice and dark vibe. Maybe you know this plugin already. It's actually also one of my favorite plugins, but I don't use it too much, but it can really take your synth sounds to the next level. After that, we have also one plugin that I really liked, but I actually forgot using it a little bit. This time it worked perfect on the synth sound. So it really adds this nice distorted high end and makes the sound way more interesting in my opinion. So I came up with this plug sound here where I also added a lot of processing. Let's turn all of the effects off for now and let's have a look how this sounds. This time we're using a lot of the Valhalla shimmer effect, which is this really nice and long reverb over here. And then we're also adding quite a lot of delay. This time I actually took this echo send and I also modified it quite a bit. So we're having this interesting echo patch here, which already has a nice filter applied and also a little bit of reverb. But for this lead sound, I actually find it quite more interesting when we turn down the width over here almost to mono. But it can make space for your other synth sounds and also make your sound way more interesting. And also we added a lot of distortion here on this rack. I have the decapitator turned all the way up, of course, because the signal is also quite low. And then I also have this radiator amp, which are both adding this really nice, interesting texture. If you want to make your track stand out, you have to use techniques like this to really make them sound different from other producers. So let's have a look at this effect chain. First, we're using a chorus here from Arturia. This is actually an emulation of the legendary Juno 60. Then we're adding some reverb actually already on the patch. This time we're using the Valhalla Room just at 3 seconds, so it's not too big. After that, I added this Saturn effect, which has some really nice distortion just in the warm tape mode. Then we want to compress the sound also quite heavily. It works really good with those plug sounds. Then some simple EQing again. So then I have actually two different pad sounds over here. This is more of a higher pad sound. Yeah, a really lovely sound, and Pigments just works really good for those sounds. They have a lot of nice ambient patches and just works perfect for those atmospheric dark tracks. You already saw I just added some basic adjustments over here, and we're also making the sound actually into mono, which is really important in the mix. You can see we're starting out with a very wide sound, and if you would have this in the solo mode, you would think, yeah, it's better without the utility. But guys, you always have to listen in the mix and turn off this freaking solo mode. And that way I found it just works way better if you have this in mono. And then we added actually a little bit of sand reverb, so of course it's not all the way in mono, but we want to make some space for this main lead sound. Then as I said, we have this low pad sound. I did a similar technique here, but not too much processing. This is actually my favorite preset out of this plugin. It just works really good. And at the end we have another atmospheric sound. This is a bit more of a noise sound. You can probably also find this in your presets here. So now is actually the time where we created all of our main elements and we can finally start arranging our track. And as I said in the intro, we want to forget all the arrangement rules that we learned before if we want to create a track that is driven by the synths that we have here. And for that we can still have a look at some other tracks. And for that I've loaded up two very famous classics over here. The first one is Gravity by Mind Against and the second one is Lies by Tale of Us. And they are both more in the category of those old and very dark sounding afterlife tracks. The first one is actually a bit more of a common arrangement where we start with a very empty track where there's not many drums in the beginning. Then later on Mind Against adding some very minimalistic but unique sounding drums. And then we are going into a big break over here, which is actually coming in quite late as we compare it to some other more modern sounding melodic techno tracks, but that's what I mean with synthesizer driven arrangements. And we see the same here in the Tale of Us track, which actually doesn't have any drums at all. This is also just completely driven by the synthesizers, and as you can see here, those synths here are really directing the track completely. And then there's of course some other stuff coming in later. But I just wanted to show you that we don't really have any rules here and we can really play around with it. And how I usually do it, I go back into my session view here and I'm just testing out which elements could already work for the intro, for example, which would sound nice on its own. For example, we could leave the drums away and also just start with a very dark sounding kick and bass line here and then maybe just add this noise sound. And then later we're gonna add in the lead and some other stuff and also the drums. And let's just see if that could sound good on its own. So this is, I think, the nice dark atmosphere. Of course, we could start also without the noise here, and we can also cut away the bass a little bit. So I think this is actually a good way to start. So let's just bring this over in the arrangement view, and then we're just gonna start arranging this track. So what I did just now is that I actually took all of our loops here and actually stretched them all out to a full track size. And we're gonna use the Mind Against track here as a reference. And in my opinion, this is just the easiest way of coming up with a unique arrangement here, because you can just play around with your synthesizers and just record some automations while going. And then you're gonna cut away and add some drums in later. And that way you're just more focused on the synthesizer sounds than rather following some structured arrangements here. But of course, as I said, we already know that we want to introduce the drums here later, so we can cut them away. Also, we don't want to have too many melodic elements at the beginning, so I will also cut them away here. Maybe we're gonna use the noise, and also we're gonna introduce this main lead sound here, but also all this melodic content can already go into the back. So what we can also do already is go into the bass patch here and do a simple automation for this bass line, so it's coming in a bit darker at the beginning. This is good for now, we can come back to this later. What we actually hear in a lot of those darker tracks is that we already from the beginning on have a very nice atmosphere sound. But for that we don't want to have any melodic content going on here. We just want to have a very basic patch. It could look something like this. Or we could even take the F here away and just leave a very simple note. And that could already create a nice atmosphere in our track. As I mentioned already in a previous video, if you want to create this nice atmospheres, it's much better to just focus on one very narrow frequency range. And now we just also have a lot of high end in this patch, but this is not how we are creating this dark atmosphere. So I'm gonna start here also very low. We could also add a little bit more reverb to create this big atmosphere. And we could bring it up a bit later and maybe even use the pads here later on in the break. And here we could even introduce the second note maybe to add a little bit more melodic tension. And now let's see how we can use this noise here. For the beginning, I would really like to have this track starting a bit darker, so this noise is taking this away a little bit. So we can also introduce this slightly by just using this very simple volume automation here. So now we've already created a nice simple atmosphere. The track is slowly building up in pace here. And then we can already think about what drums we would add first. I really like this low percussion sound here. I think we could start with that one first. Then we could add the shaker, which also has a very nice dark vibe. And this hi-hat we actually want to introduce much later to give some tension on when the track could need some extra drive here. And as I said, the most important thing here is to automate our lead properly, and that will of course also drive the automation of our track here. So I'm just gonna choose some parameters here. We can use the envelope amount, the cutoff, maybe even the resonance, and then we can bring in this oscillator at some parts, maybe turn up the noise at some parts to make it more interesting. And of course we could also play around with the envelopes a bit, but I think that's already quite a bit for now. Now what you could do is to map all of those parameters to your MIDI controller, where you maybe have a couple of knobs applied, and then you could just record it 1 or 2 times and really twist them all at the same time. But what we're gonna do now is that I'm really just gonna do it very simple. With my mouse here, just hit the record button and do some very basic automations so you can see exactly how we do that. So as you can see, we have the frequency here all the way down, but the lead sound is still quite loud. So we could turn this frequency mod def here down a bit. And sometimes it's just also good to, again, use a very simple volume automation. That should always work very good. this noise we can really make a bit louder at the parts where we're having actually a transition, and then we can take it down a bit here in this other part so they don't get too annoying. And you can already see the shaker sound is coming in here quite nicely. And yeah, I think now we already laid the nice foundation for all the automations here with the lead synth. So let's finally go in here and just record some humanized movement. So this is just the first row of automation here, and while playing I already figured out where I want to introduce the new elements here, and so I figured out we could add this high end here a bit earlier because the track could start getting a bit boring, and then maybe even also add the clap here in a bit earlier, and then we could also add a minimal tiny break like Mind Against is also doing it. And yeah, while recording here I already figured out that this could be a good position to do that, and I've already created this nice little build up here in the automation. So let's just try to take the kick away and maybe even some of the drums. Those melodics here again coming in way too early. We want to introduce them right in front of the drop, so the tension gets released over here, but here we want to still have this tension, dark atmosphere. And also guys, remember that it's not always the best thing to just build up your automations all the time. We also want to create some tension by taking them down again here, even though we are still building up the track. So we can go in here manually and just do it by hand and also take down this automation like that. You have this very nice knobs here, by the way, if you didn't know, where you can just tilt this whole automation down a bit and then just maybe to make it a bit smoother, delete those ones over here. You can see now we're really nicely building up those melodics here, and I think we could also already go on the break somewhere over here. So now we've already have this lead in quite a while in the track. It's not really getting boring yet because we're going to add some more automations on the go here. But of course, if we're going to go on for a 7-minute track, it could start to get boring. So that's why we introduced these melodic elements over here. And that's why we also created this lead plug that could come in over here and maybe even somewhere later in the break. But let's just focus on the intro part here first, and then we can go and tweak the break here later on a bit. Because first I just want to finish all those automations here. So already getting way more interesting with the resonance here. At the end here, when we are going into the break, I usually always do this, just add a little bit of that echo effect and sometimes even turn the reverb up a bit. Maybe this time we could use the shimmer because it really has this very long and nice decay, and that's just way smoother to go into the break here. So I'm gonna go back into the lead and record the next round. I wanna add the second oscillator. I think I would also like to add some more noise at some points, so let's do another recording. So I think you can already see how much more interesting this lead sound is now that we've already added 5 layers of automations. Of course, we can just go in here and still play around with some more settings. We could even add this third oscillator here. And as I said, it's sometimes really nice to play around with the envelopes. Maybe I'm gonna do this later, but for this tutorial, I think this should work fine now. So let's try to work on this break here a little bit and see if we could make it a bit more interesting when we add this lead plug. And also, of course, if we introduce this plug sound here straight after we also cut away the other lead sound, it would be a bit too much of a drastic change. Now we actually have 2 options here. We could bring in this other lead sound here slowly already in this part over here. Or what we could do is let the pads take over in this part and then just slowly introduce this lead sound. And I think that's what we're gonna do here. So I'm just gonna use a utility as a basic automation to start with. And yeah, we can introduce it here, but just turn down the volume quite a bit. So this higher pad sound could come in a bit later, so we're just opening the frequency range up in the break a bit. So of course we also need to do a lot of automation work here. I'm gonna choose the cutoff, the envelope, and yeah, maybe for this one we could play really around with the envelopes a bit, but let's start the recording. Sometimes easier to just go in the synth actually. Yeah, I think this is the part where the break is becoming long enough and we could already add the kick and bass here back in again. So I'm just gonna take this over here. And yeah, definitely we also wanna tweak those pad sounds here a bit. Yeah, we could take it up here and then we could go darker a bit in the break. So this is actually very important that you also have some pretty much quiet moments where there's not much going on in the track, and you're also gonna take out all of the high frequencies. This is actually a very common beginner mistakes that yeah, most people don't really allow for any silence, and especially in those dark ethereal vibe tracks, we want to allow some quiet moments, and we're not achieving this if we are constantly adding new elements and completely losing this minimal vibe of those tracks. And I think on the drop we probably want to go back into the dark mode. So we're going to take all of the melodic elements out, and then we could even already take the pad out here a bit earlier. Let's play this together with the lead. Now this is just a very basic arrangement so far, and the drop is not really sounding that interesting. One reason for that is that we are just adding this drop straight when this other lead sounds ends. So as I said before, we don't actually have any silence in the track, so we could take it down here a bit, and then we could also try to add some more interesting automations here. One technique that I really liked recently is a bit more of an advanced one, but some people of you might know this delay effect from Arturia. It's also an emulation of the analog real-world equipment, and it just has this really nice intensity knob. So maybe we could play around with something like this. I'm just gonna put it in the sync mode here, and let's just try to add this by automating the dry and wet first. And then we can just turn this intensity up here over the time, and I'm gonna show you how this sounds now. And what we could do with this is just apply some other automations later on, so we can really make this drop completely unique. And first of all, I actually want to take this into mono and don't have any stereo sound at all. And then we could add some other automations. Sometimes I really like to play around with a redox effect here. And you can use a downsample rate. So that sounds quite interesting, but not really perfect. What you can actually hear that I'm moving this up and down. So what I'm gonna do is just recreate this in a more minimalistic way here. And of course, this is not everything. We could go on here a bit and maybe add some reverb right in front of the drop. So we also have like a small build up here. And then I wanna actually have this delay effect coming in here a bit later. So we're just gonna turn this down and see how that sounds. So still not really perfect, but guys, of course, for some crazy automations like this, you really need to take your time and don't give up straight away. So I think this could sound interesting now. What is very important for this effect that we also add some sidechain to the kick. So I think that could sound way more interesting if we have this a bit more of a pumping effect. Yeah guys, of course this is not perfect, but I just wanted to show you some unique ways to really take a drop here to the next level and really get some unique arrangement. But let's just not bother too much. So now we could think how we structure this build up here again. And as I said, we can use a similar technique. You're gonna bring in this low percussion sound here and the lead at the same time. Then we wanna add this shaker sound. Sometimes it's also really good, very common arrangement technique to have another third little break here again, where we actually don't cut away the stuff completely, but we're gonna cut away the kick and the bass to build some final tension right before we actually cut away all the melodic elements here. And also that could be a good position to cut away some of the drums again. We don't need the clap afterwards, and If we want to cut the attention away completely, we could also take away this hi-hat sound here and just fade this track out slowly. But let's of course work first on the automations here on our lead, and then we can make the final decisions later. Just gonna take the volume down here by the start again, but this time we can bring it in a bit faster on the second one, because yeah, the listener has already heard it coming in slowly here. So guys, I just finished all the automations here for our lead synth, and now we can go here and do a little bit of a micro arrangement. First of all, I actually want to have the bass here playing in the break, because it's just taking a little bit too much away off the low end. And then maybe we can cut away the drums here already a little bit earlier. And if you just want to create some transitions here, a quick and easy way is just to go into your drum sounds, and then you could just add a send reverb at some places at the end of your bar here. So that just sounds like this. So you can see just like that we created a kind of natural transition, and it's not stopping so abruptly. And of course we can also go in here and do some little micro adjustments, like cutting away the kick at some parts. Just makes your track a little bit more interesting, adding those little adjustments. And then of course we also want to automate this lead plug here and have a nice big opening right in front of this last tiny dark drop here. So I think that already sounds great. We don't need to do much more. Now we can just do a very simple outro where we're just slowly cutting away all of those drum sounds. Yeah, and then we can also cut away this lead sound at the end and just leave this dark outro. Maybe we can play this percussion sound even all the way through, so it's not so empty, the track. Then we can just take this noise down here piece by piece. What we could do is also do the opposite, what we did before. We just add this very simple pad sound for the atmosphere, and then of course we want to have it here the opposite, getting darker and darker over the time and just slowly fading out. We get back to this very minimalistic dark vibe. We already came up with pretty much a full-blown track, and there's just the little details missing. But now you can see how those unique and darker sounding tracks are arranged and how those are very driven by those lead sounds. They don't follow any structure. We just played around here with some automations. And yeah guys, if you made it this far, I really thank you for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed this and could learn something from this tutorial. If so, I would really appreciate it if you leave a like, and maybe if you have some extra time, you can also of course leave a comment. And this template will of course be available for all my Patreons. Link for that is in the description. Thank you guys for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.